Well, welcome everybody. As I just mentioned, if anybody just hopped on in the last 30 seconds, we are recording tonight. So if you can just make sure your microphone is off until the Q&A session and you're queued up, ready to ask something. Just briefly, my name is Andy. I'm the newest addition to LFDC. If you don't know a lot about LFDC, we are a forest advocacy group here in Washington State, based out of Washington State at least. We've been mostly focused on state lands issues for the past few years, and with the addition of me back at the end of last year, we have expanded our scope to start looking at federal issues, which is one of the reasons why we started up these monthly federal forest webinars. So thank you again. There's a lot going on at the federal level, so it's honestly can be hard to decide what is even the right thing to focus on at any one moment. The Roadless Rule that we'll be talking about tonight, we expect some new developments on that in the next maybe 4 to 6 weeks. So that's why we've got this presentation prepared to get folks talking about it and equipped with a few tools as to what we can do to respond to this, to the attacks on the Roadless Rule. What's going on here? There we are. Before we get going, I do want to just acknowledge that I live on stolen land. We all live on stolen land. So I'd like to just start by respectfully acknowledging that I, at least, am on the Suquamish, Skokomish, and S'Klallam people's land. They have been stewarding this land for countless generations, and we have a lot to learn, I think, from that approach. And I think it's really especially important to acknowledge that we need to do more than just talk about it. We need to do a better job of actually acting on these sort of acknowledgments, and that's especially for someone like me. I need to be leveraging the privilege that I have to amplify Indigenous voices and tribal leadership, whether that's people directly involved in stewarding the land, or people that are increasing capacity at tribes to be able to engage with these sort of things beyond just the absolute vital necessities that a lot of folks, tribal or otherwise, are struggling with. So just a quick overview of what we'll be talking about. We'll start by just going over what the Roadless Rule is and why it ever came about. We'll talk about the benefits that it serves, what it does to help keep forests intact. I think it's really important when we talk about healthy forests, that's really not a whole lot of description in a healthy forest. And I think connecting those two ideas, an intact forest is a healthy forest, is a great place to start from when we're talking about healthy forests. So we'll talk about what the Roadless Rule does to keep forests intact. We'll talk about the repeal, of course, and the current status of the repeal, and then for sure we'll try and think creatively about what we can do to respond to those, to the oncoming attack of the Roadless Rule. And of course, we'll have time to talk about some questions and answers. And we will take a little quick detour at the end. There's some maybe more urgent or more time-sensitive issues that we can take action on that are also connected to this. And we'll talk about that towards the end of the presentation. So why do we have a Roadless Rule? If we zoom all the way back to the beginning of the Forest Service, around the turn of the century, around 1900, Gifford Pinchot, and the formation of the Forest Service. Between that time, around 1900, and the modern environmentalist movement in the 60s, a lot of roads got built in the backcountry. And I think it's out of sight a lot of times, so folks didn't necessarily realize it. And it wasn't until, we started taking a look at some of the environmental degradation that was going on public lands that folks started to realize that there was a need to respond to what's going on. And so this map that's on the screen, all those little black squiggly lines that you see, those are dirt or gravel roads. And then the red lines are paved roads. And that is just the U.S. Forest Service system. That's not the National Park. That's not Washington DNR, that's not the BLM, that's just within the Forest Service. So you can see the statistics there, just between Washington and Oregon, about 90,000 miles of forest roads. So there's a lot of Downsides to forest roads, there's some advantages, of course. There's the recreation that getting into the forest allows. There's the ability to respond to emergencies, whether that's a rescue that's happening, or some other thing that's going on in the backcountry. So we definitely have a need for some roads in our forest lands, but certainly even back in the 60s, we realized that there was maybe an excess of forest roads, especially if we're looking to maintain the ecological integrity of our forests. So if we go to 1964, that's the passage of the Wilderness Act, which is really kind of the very beginning of any talk of roadless areas at the federal level. So one of the things that came out of the Wilderness Act in 1964 was a very systematic review of our public lands and trying to identify areas that are fit for wilderness protection. So wilderness protections that's kind of the highest level of protection. That's places that are really almost entirely free of human impact. Certainly there's going to be some things, trails and really old things that maybe we didn't do a good job of cleaning up. But for the most part, wilderness is mostly untouched by, if you're just looking around the landscape, you shouldn't see a lot of evidence of human activity there. Roadless areas either have a little bit more infrastructure or a little bit more development, or they're smaller and scattered, and so they don't necessarily serve the same ecological function that a wilderness area would. And so the roadless areas are kind of, maybe you might think of it as wilderness light. They're not quite as valuable ecologically in some senses, or even in a recreation sense if you want to get out and really have a primitive experience. But we'll talk about some of the real value that the roadless areas provide. So when we talk about, you'll hear the term inventoried roadless area, and that those roadless area review and evaluations, there were two of them. We don't need to get into the specifics of why they had two of them, but those were the inventories that established that catalog essentially of inventoried roadless areas that are now protected by the Roadless Area Conservation Rule that we have. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and even into the 80s, really, there was a lot of back and forth about what we should do with these analyses of our, trying to find those landscapes that are less impacted by human development. The wilderness areas are all actually, not all of them, but the vast majority of them are actually passed by law. So there's a piece of legislation associated with most designated wilderness in the U.S. So that's not something that the administration of the Forest Service can decide that they're going to respect or not. Well, it shouldn't be something that they can decide whether they respect or not. But roadless areas, there was never a law passed to protect roadless areas. So that's always just been, and we'll go into the more specifics, that's always just been a rule on the books, kind of more of a regulation or an agency rule rather than an actual piece of law. So fast forward to if we want to zoom in on where the nucleus of the current rule that we have that we're trying to protect, we got to go back to 1998. The Forest Service chief towards the end of the Clinton administration issued a moratorium on new road building in roadless areas, and that was kind of the start of what we now have today as the Roadless Rule. So they held a lot of hearings, or not necessarily hearings, public meetings, to figure out what makes sense to do with these roadless rules, if anything should be done about it. They solicited comments, and of course this is 1999, 2000, so a lot of these comments were actual letters or in person, signing on to a statement. Email wasn't quite as much of a thing, but even so, 1.6 million comments. Actually, I think it's almost 1.6.5 or 1.65 million comments were received. I tried to find really detailed analysis of those comments, or actually get the comments themselves and take a look. It would probably take a Freedom of Information Act to actually get those comments. But everything that I found was that those comments were overwhelmingly in support of protections for roadless rules. So 2001, the outgoing Clinton administration, it was actually the ones who adopted the rule and instructed the Forest Service to start following the Roadless Area Conservation Rule. Of course, the administration, the White House, everything changed hands, flipped from blue to red, and the Bush administration proposed their own version of the rule, which had a lot of the same protections, but it basically put all the decision making up to the states. And so a lot of the states that were challenging the roadless rule in court or in the court of public opinion, those states would have been opting out and kind of creating their own weakened rules. And in fact, even today, Colorado and Idaho were successful in getting their own versions of the roadless rule, which kind of have different tiers of protection depending on the specific area. And really what that amounts to is the places that were valuable timber got the lowest amount of protection, and those areas ended up being in their catalog of areas to get logged on a, whatever it is, 30, 40-year basis. And by and large, those protections in Idaho and Colorado aren't nearly as protective as the nationwide rule that impacts the rest of the country. And actually, just in the past couple of years, I think it was 2022 and 23, Alaska successfully got their own exemption to the roadless rule for Tongass, although right at the end of the Biden administration that was revoked. So as of now, Tongass is back in, which is why sometimes you'll see different numbers as far as how many acres, how many square miles are protected by the roadless rule. Some people include Tongass, some don't. Some people include Idaho and Colorado, some don't. So that's why you might see a mismatch of some different numbers as to how much the roadless rule protects. But the important thing that I think to take away from this is it was a pretty extended, 10, 12-year battle in the courts. I think there was 6 major lawsuits that finally kind of exhausted all of the avenues in the courts to challenge the rule. And Earth Justice has a really good tool, really good resource on their website that goes over a lot of that battle. They were the ones that were kind of leading the charge to get the roadless rule permanently adopted. And really the big takeaway, I think, is that not only was it Earth Justice, it was at least 20 other organizations that were in a big coalition that were working together, that were supporting each other financially in some instances, certainly supporting each other in coalition building as far as getting public support and public comment, and generating the evidence, if you want to call it that, in court that was able to get the courts to uphold the roadless rule. And since 2013, at least 2013 up until last year, the roadless rule was doing its thing. It was preventing the things that it was going to prevent, and there weren't a whole lot of new avenues to challenge it. So that gets us kind of an introduction as to how the rule came about, what the rule does. So by and large, it prevents logging, road building, mining on designated roadless areas, that inventory that I mentioned earlier. So in Washington and Oregon, it's about 2 million acres in each state. You can see this map, all those little orange blobs, orange sections are areas that are inventoried roadless areas. And you can see Idaho has quite a bit, actually, which is why they were really gung-ho about getting their own rule. And what was the kind of the justification that was used to put those limitations in place? Number one, we have a lot of roads. The Forest Service has a backlog of maintenance that is not occurring on Forest Service roads, and that creates a liability for them. And then, as I mentioned, going all the way back to the 60s, there was concern about the ecological degradation that's associated with roads in the backcountry. So those two things, combined with all of the different ways that they might be liabilities for the federal government in terms of somebody getting injured because the road is in disrepair, or endangered species being threatened because of ecological degradation. Those lawsuits and just the cost of maintaining the roads are the things that really were the justification in the courts for getting the rule upheld. And you can see there are 9 million acres in Alaska. This kind of really, I think, puts a fine point on the benefit, as far as the benefit to the ecosystems, to the landscape. Those purple areas that you see there are the 2 national parks in Southeast Alaska. That's Kluane is kind of the top center there, and then a little bit down and to the right is Glacier Bay National Park. And then green is designated wilderness areas, which we mentioned is protected by law for the most part. And then all the orange in between is the roadless areas. So you can see how especially those wilderness areas are quite scattered, and the roadless areas act to connect those and create more cohesive, continuous corridors for wildlife, protects areas of spawning habitat for salmon, all sorts of different benefits. And the roadless areas are really good at kind of connecting what otherwise might be fragmented portions that are protected by maybe even to a higher standard than the roadless rule. But the deer, the beavers, they don't understand what's what. So the roadless areas are really powerful tool in connecting some of those other interconnected or disconnected areas of protection. And so where are we at today? We can see, it's Secretary Brooke Rollins is our Secretary of Agriculture, which is the Forest Service. And so it was, I think, July of last year, held a press conference, and they justified where we want to rescind the roadless rule because it's preventing us from preventing or addressing the risk of wildfire, and number two, the White House says we need to cut more trees, and this is preventing us from doing that. So first of all, both of those things, well, we can debate the validity of whether we need to go into the backcountry to address wildfire or whether we need to be cutting down more trees on public land. But besides all that, the roadless rule already actually has exemptions for both of those things. Especially the fire is the one that's explicitly called out in the roadless rule. So there's not even any reading in between the lines to be able to justify activity in roadless areas for fire prevention. It explicitly says that you can build roads, you can harvest timber if it's for reducing the risk of quote uncharacteristic wildfire effects. So and just to be clear, LFDC, we don't want them to be doing that. It's our opinion that thinning, logging in the backcountry is not what we should be doing to address the risk of severe wildfire, and we're going to tease that apart pretty thoroughly here. But just even their justification, even if it were true that we needed to be in the backcountry to prevent wildfires, the roadless rule already allows for that. So there's no need to repeal the rule to be able to do the things that they're saying that they want to do. And all of that is really based on this continuing narrative. I was listening to the confirmation hearings for our soon-to-be BLM director, Steve Pierce, and probably about 10 times this idea of there's not enough active management going on in the backcountry. There's not enough active management going on our public lands, and I've got some issues with that. I think the science also has some issues with that. So what actually is going on with wildfires? This picture here is pretty powerful. I think this is the Palisades fire. That's the LA fires from January of last year. It was a pretty busy wildfire season at that time. You had the Eaton fire and this fire going on simultaneously, quite close together. But in the lead up to these fires, it was the driest 9 months on record in Southern California. So we had extremely dry conditions on the ground. There were all sorts of red flag warnings from Cal Fire. And then in addition to the drought that was going on that season, there were also unusually strong Santa Ana winds, which are, I'm not really, an expert on climate in Southern California, but something about the winds are actually blowing offshore. And in this case, the winds were over 100 miles an hour. So that's, low force, low grade hurricane winds in Southern California with this extreme drought going on. And the Palisade fire was human caused. We know the arsonist that caused it is in custody. He's facing federal charges. It started on New Year's Eve or New Year's morning, I think technically just after midnight. And this was a really devastating fire. It destroyed 6,000 structures. A lot, I think maybe 10 or 12 people were killed in just the Palisades fire. That doesn't include the Eaton fire. So it's, there's definitely a real hazard that we're facing because of the severe wildfires that we're facing. But it's really important, I think, to kind of be a little bit more specific or look at it a bit more nuanced than a lot of times you'll see in the media. So I wanted to pull apart the difference between a high intensity fire and a fast moving and dangerous fire, because those are not necessarily the same things. They might be the same things in some cases, but high intensity fires are part of nature. Stand replacing fires have occurred in Western landscapes here in the US and really the entire world. As far as we go back, we can look at records from the smoke being emitted, and those actually end up in the tree rings. They can do all sorts of analysis and determine when there were high intensity fires. And so there's not anything inherently bad about a high intensity fire. In fact, in a lot of cases, they do good things. They create habitat that's very rare otherwise. But the fast moving fires are the thing that are quite dangerous as far as danger to human life and human property. And so what are the things that are driving fast moving fires? There's really three major factors. You'll hear this term a vapor pressure deficit. So that's really low surface moisture. So that was definitely the case in the Palisades fire. They hadn't had rain in more than 8 months. So the ground was extremely dry. The other things that can lead to that vapor pressure deficit is a reduced canopy cover. So if the trees are very thin, if we're talking about more up here in the Northwest, if the forest is relatively thin and you have a lot more solar radiation getting to the ground, that's going to dry things out. Of course, you also have snow melt and other things that we'll talk about in a little bit. Pile on top of that vapor pressure deficit, a buildup of fine fuels. There's a few reasons that that's going to be a factor in certain cases. The single largest factor is Smokey the Bear and the last 100 years of people being really afraid of fires and this notion of putting out every fire as fast as we can. We're starting to get away from that in the last 10 years maybe, but for a long time, we were doing pretty much everything we could to put every fire out as fast as we could. And then on top of that, this is kind of the trifecta that they dealt with in Southern California, high wind speeds. So, the Santa Ana winds, those aren't anything that we have direct control over, but there's other causes for high wind in the forest. Clear cuts, that wind is going to be driving over the top of a dense forest. And then when it hits a clear cut, that's a low pressure area. That wind's actually going to accelerate there. And then, whatever direction the wind is heading, it's going to pick up speed when it hits a clear cut and be able to have a stronger effect wherever it finally meets a denser stand. And then, of course, thinner density, which is the case in Palisades. That's mostly actually shrub and shorter trees, and it's really not a dense landscape, a dense vegetation in Southern California. And so those, obviously, the denser the forest is, the harder it is for wind to be able to blow through there, right? And if we go kind of looking more at what size and a little bit talking more specifically about the Northwest, we have local variables, and so those are things I've been touching on. Reduced canopy cover, drying out ground conditions, higher wind speeds. We have fuel buildup not only from fire suppression but also from plantation. So if the Forest Service or DNR clear cuts an area, the company's going to come in as part of the contract. They come in and replant it. They're going to plant it actually much more dense than they want the final product to be, because they expect some amount of mortality. But a lot of times the mortality is actually lower than expected to be, and so we end up with stands at 20 or 30 years that are much denser than they would otherwise be in natural conditions. And you might hear them called zombie forests, and it's almost so dense that you can't walk through there. And a lot of the reason you can't walk through there is because all the dead branches are still hanging off those 20 or 30-year-old trees. And those dead branches that are attached to trees are the absolute perfect place for fire to start to whip through a stand. They stay off the ground, so even if it rains, they dry out really quickly. They build up and are just like nice little perfect pieces of kindling, basically, to get a fire really hot and able to spread up into the crown. And then another thing that's associated with plantation timber stand management is invasives. Here in the Northwest, the number one highly flammable invasive is Scotch broom, and that's really common. An area gets logged. They come back in a few years and replant it, but in between them planting and coming back and doing their first round of thinning, the place will just be covered in Scotch broom, and Scotch broom is really, really flammable in the summer months in August and September. So definitely something to be aware of, just the plantation management contributing to some of these wildfire activities. And so we layer on top of that changing climate. So this year, it's perfect example, really low snowpack. It's very likely, or it's entirely plausible at least, that we'll have a relatively warm spring. And so not only do we have a low snowpack, we have a warm spring. So instead of having the mountains be pretty dry and snow free for maybe just July, August, September, or maybe October, 4 months, something like that. We might have 6 or 7 or 8 months where there's no snow melt and a lot drier conditions in a lot of our low elevation forests. We've all experienced some of the intense heat events that we've had in the past few years. I've only been in Washington since 2011, so I don't know. I can't speak personally as to how often that was in the past. Folks that I've talked to say that these heat dooms are relatively new, unusual phenomenon, and that's part of the changing jet stream as we're changing some ocean currents and all sorts of different things as the climate is warming. And then those Santa Ana winds that we mentioned earlier, so those high wind events are becoming more common. Not as much here in the Northwest, but definitely in California, those high wind events are a big thing. And then the portions of our forest that are highly fire resistant are old growth. We're not losing old growth right now in the Northwest. The Northwest Forest Plan has done a pretty good job, well, at least on federal land, and specifically on Forest Service land. So that's really kind of limited to Washington State. We've got a lot more forest controlled by the BLM that doesn't have the Northwest Forest Plan in Oregon. But here in Washington State, our federal old growth forests have been pretty stable. And in fact, technically, in the past 20 years, we've seen a tiny amount of increase in old growth in the federal forest system here in Washington, although it's just barely kind of breaking even is mostly where we're at. And those old growth forests are what are the most fire resistant. So they might burn on a longer basis like we're used to here in the Northwest. But those old growth forests are the most resistant to having those really intense fires that move quickly, that really devastate the landscape. Old growth, by and large, has evolved to cope with the fire severity that has been typical based on the climate here in the Northwest. So you add all that together, and all that adds up to fast-moving fires, which are the dangerous ones, the ones that they might start on Monday, and by Wednesday they're 10 times the size they were, and they're encroaching on buildings and homes and neighborhoods pretty quickly. So. Your email that you got tonight, just in an hour before we started, includes a link to this slideshow. And so you can see here, I've got a hyperlink there on this slide. That's to a really amazing, pretty concise resource that explains in much better detail and much more eloquently than I have how all these factors kind of work together or work against us to create not only high severity fires, but dangerous, fast moving fires. And that is a really great resource to get familiar with if you're going to be engaging with these topics. So where do things stand? So as I mentioned, the repeal started last summer. They had a short comment period. More than 600,000 comments were received. I think 90% of them were in favor of maintaining the rule. Despite that, the federal government has decided to move forward with repealing the rule. We expect sometime in the next 4 to 6 weeks for a draft EIS to be published. So that's kind of the government investigating what the possible environmental outcomes of repealing this rule will be. As it happens, the Forest Service is in the middle of changing their regulations, and so there's some possibility they won't even publish that draft. Fingers crossed that they will. I think it's a high enough, important enough topic that they probably will still publish the draft, and that will open up at least a 20-day comment period. In the past, that would have been a 45-day comment period. We'll see what we get. But I think it's just important to realize that whatever comments get submitted, just like whatever comments were submitted last year, there's a good chance that they won't pay much attention to those, and that's why that last block you see there on the right, what we can definitely make progress on is putting pressure on Congress to get the roadless area conservation rules protected by law. So last year, Maria Cantwell she was the lead sponsor on the 2025 Roadless Area Conservation Act, which basically just takes exactly what the protections are currently and makes those law. As I mentioned, there's already exceptions for road building and timber harvesting in roadless areas, so there's definitely room for improvement on the roadless rule, but it didn't ever make it out of committee. So right now there's not any progress being made on that. So I'll talk about how we can hopefully push that in the right direction here. And what we can do right now. So as I mentioned, we expect a comment period to open up hopefully in the next few weeks. LFDC will be sending out an action alert with a detailed commenting toolkit for that. So, we will have just a form letter that if you want to copy and paste that and send it in, you can do that. But really, it's better if you can write your own comments. It's obviously more time consuming, but there's a lot more power in writing a comment that expresses, how you will be impacted by the repeal of the rule. So as much as you can, it's helpful to write your own comment, and we'll have some tools available to help with that. We actually already have a couple new web pages on our website that are covering federal issues, and one of those is specifically talking about writing what's known as substantive comments for NEPA analysis, and that will be this EIS that I've been mentioning. That's a NEPA document that. And there's certain kind of almost gotcha requirements that the Forest Service has that if you don't do this, then your comment might not even be considered. So all that will be addressed in that toolkit that we put out. And between now and then, one of the things that I included in that email that came out right before we started tonight is a list of hikes that are in roadless areas here in Washington, almost entirely on the west side here. Just for time's sake, I didn't have a chance to do the whole state or down in Oregon, but I'm happy if you're not on the west side, if you're in eastern Washington, or if you're in Oregon and you want to know where you can go and experience the roadless area, email me. I'm happy to provide that for you. And so, if you're going to a roadless area to go on a hike, taking photos that you can include with your either letters to Congress or even with your comments that get submitted to the Forest Service when that comment period opens up. Those are really compelling. They show that you're not just somebody who's kind of a keyboard warrior, and you're actually out there using these areas for some purpose, whether it's just recreation or foraging or some sort of hobby that you have. And then of course, social media is one of the important tools of today. So as much as we can, maybe a video saying, hey, I'm out here in the Olympics. So for example, as I was researching the areas that you can go out on a hike in a roadless area, some of the most popular places to go in the Olympics, especially on the eastern side of the Olympics that are more accessible to to Tacoma and Seattle, some of the larger cities. Lena Lake, a lot of people might know that one. Mount Eleanor, the Dungeness area up in the northeast corner of the Olympics. There's pretty popular, highly trafficked areas that are almost entirely in roadless areas. And it's probably unlikely that the Forest Service is going to go there and start logging. That would be creating too much of an uproar. So it's unlikely that those places will be negatively impacted if the roadless rule gets repealed. But it certainly opens up those possibilities. So definitely something to be aware of and get familiar with some of the roadless areas that maybe you already travel to or you might go and enjoy in the future. And as far as pushing Congress to get a law written that'll protect roadless, really the best thing you can do is calling. So when you send an email to Congress, those emails basically get aggregated into a spreadsheet. That's basically, if a keyword was mentioned in the email, it's very unlikely that a senator or Congress, a House rep is going to be reading your email. At best, they might be getting read by a staffer. I wouldn't be surprised if they're just getting read by AI and they're getting compiled and put into a spreadsheet. Whereas when you call, there's a good chance, in my experience, that you'll get somebody to pick up the phone. So calling is definitely the thing to do if you can. And when you call, it's really helpful to ask for the public land staffer or the environmental staffer. They're the one that's going to be at least care a little bit more that you're calling about this issue and be more likely to make sure that your specific comments are passed along to your representative. So calling is definitely a super powerful tool to getting Congress to act and hopefully get a law advanced that protects the roadless rule. As I mentioned, we'll have a more detailed toolkit, but just kind of, plant the seeds of what things you might want to mention in your comments, either to the Forest Service or to your congressperson, starting to change the narrative about wildfire. So, recognizing that fire actually is a natural part of the ecosystem and that there's just way too much forest for us to expect that we're going to log our way out of forest fires. We would basically just need to continuously thin we'd need millions and millions of people out in the forest thinning continuously if we were going to actually, create conditions that prevented wildfires. So that's just not a reasonable approach. And I think, right now the administration is focused on maximizing extraction. So, emphasizing that, hey, I'm one of the people who thinks the forests are worth a whole lot more than just 2x4s or plywood at the local lumber store. So expressing all the reasons that you value a forest besides the timber that it produces. I think another thing that is a good thing to emphasize, especially if you're trying to convince somebody who's of the extraction mindset, maybe mention that roadless areas are national forests, so at most you're paying for the Northwest Forest Plan instead of a national parks pass. So it's a much more affordable way to go out and experience nature. And the very beginning of the Roadless Rule was we have too many roads and we don't have the money to maintain them. So if we're trying to save taxpayer dollars and be efficient with our federal government, building more roads in the backcountry is moving us in the wrong direction. And then of course, really, if we want to address the fire issue, probably a lot of folks on this call already know, moving from the community outward is a much more efficient way to limit the destruction from fires. So home hardening, that's defensible spaces around your house. That's, replacing your cedar shingles on the roof and covering up your bird blocking, your vents that are venting your attic. Evacuation route planning and evacuation or emergency notice systems, and then smoke centers for folks who can't stay inside when there's an intense fire in the area and they have to be out and about. So having a place for people to be able to find refuge from intense smoke. But I think really that first one, changing the narrative about fire. One of the things that some people will like to point to that demonstrates this, just the nonsense of fire prevention. Forest fires are a natural disaster, right? So you don't hear people saying only you can prevent earthquakes, only you can prevent hurricanes or tornadoes. Fires are the same thing. They are a natural part of the landscape. Mother Nature is never going to stop having fires. We need to learn how to, change our infrastructure, our development to accommodate for fires rather than trying to make the landscape accommodate to us. I mentioned, there's some weaknesses to the current Roadless Rule, and so if we were to just make the current Roadless Rule law, it would be great if we could make a few additional improvements to that. So right now, as I mentioned, there are exceptions that allow some road building and some logging. So we would love to see the rule amended or the law amended to prevent that from happening. We would love to see salvage logging explicitly prevented in roadless areas. There's a lot of value in leaving high severity fire areas intact. They create habitat that otherwise is very rare in nature. So requiring that those areas be left standing after a fire moves through. If there's a trail or if there's a road through the area, of course we want to take reasonable measures to make sure that people aren't going to be injured by some sort of hazard tree. So requiring any hazard trees that are cut down to stay on site and be large woody debris on the forest floor. Little critters love those. Right now, there's no requirement that roadless areas have any sort of tribal input. So, going back to our acknowledging that we need to do better about making good on rather than just paying lip service to the injustice that's been done. We really would love to have more tribal input on the management of our public lands, whether that's just out of respect for the usage of tribes of public land, or leveraging the knowledge that tribal land practitioners might have. And then last thing, of course, a lot of the ignitions occur, human ignitions of wildfires occur at roads. So as much as we can, decommissioning roads and reducing the opportunity for human ignitions as much as possible, while being, respecting the reality that getting into the backcountry and experiencing nature is super important. If people can't get out and experience nature, then they're not going to care about it. So there's definitely a balance of, we don't want to decommission every Forest Service road, but if it's just kind of something that doesn't lead to a trail, doesn't lead to a place where people go and recreate, we should be considering decommissioning those roads, and also addressing, there's a lot of unauthorized roads, whether that's four-wheelers that are able to, or Jeeps and stuff that are able to essentially start to develop their own roads in certain areas, and addressing those things as we can. So some resources, there's some stuff here from Earth Justice. There's some really great resources from the John Muir Project. They have a modified Roadless Area Conservation Act that has a lot of those changes that I just mentioned on the last slide that are already introduced into a proposed piece of legislation. So they actually have some pretty good, they have somebody in Washington full time that's working with directly with senators and Congress people. So mentioning, hey, I support the John Muir Project's modified Roadless Area Conservation Act. That's a good thing to mention when you're on the phone with your congressperson. Really good resource, the wildland firefighters opinion on repealing the Roadless Rule. So there's just some good resources if you really want to dive deep. You could also read the actual text of the Roadless Rule. It's actually only a few pages, so there's not a whole lot to it. It's not all that interesting, but it obviously is a pretty powerful thing. And that is just about everything I have on the Roadless Rule. I mentioned we're going to just take a quick detour here at the end. The Forest Service recently announced new agency-specific rules to NEPA. We're going to circle back to Roadless Rule for the Q&A, but I just want to touch on this because there's only less than 2 weeks left to generate public comments on these new NEPA rules that are going on at the Forest Service. So I just wanted to, since I have a captive audience here, figured I would take just a couple minutes and cover these. It's pretty disheartening stuff. So one of my jobs with LFDC is to go onto all the different Forest Service pages and find what projects are being proposed and find the documents that the agency is preparing to get those projects underway. If these rules are adopted, we'll have either 10 or 20 days to respond to those comments, assuming that we identify them the day that the comment period opens. A lot of these documents are hundreds of pages. So the idea that, especially the public is going to be able to spend, 20, 30, 40 hours reviewing hundreds of pages of analysis and write a substantive comment in 10 days or 20 days is pretty unreasonable. The lawyers might say arbitrary and capricious. And the new rules explicitly prevent any extension to those rules. There's a limit to the length of your public comment. So you as the public now have a limit of 15 pages. That includes any references. So if you reference another document, they can say, well, that document's 10 pages and your comment's 10 pages. So we're going to decide which 5 pages we're not going to pay attention to. It also shortens the amount of time that the agency has to respond to public comments, which makes it much less likely that they're actually going to, pay much real attention to what's being put out by the public. So really really not great. So who knows if they're going to listen to any public comments anyway, but we still have to make sure we're letting them know what we think. And so what we can say in response to that, there's a really great resource, really great analysis that looked at almost 20 years of NEPA documents and the the length of those analysis, how long those projects took to get underway, and the reasons that those projects got delayed. The number one reason is a lack of funding and therefore lack of staffing. And that obviously, as you can see here by this graph, you're probably not surprised, the U.S. Forest Service has seen a significant drop in staffing. And this graph even really doesn't tell the whole story because they actually have increased the staffing in wildland firefighters. So as far as the folks that are doing NEPA analysis, that are writing documents, that are reviewing these comments, there are fewer of those people than ever before. And that includes the soil scientists and the wildlife biologists and the hydrologists and stream ecologists. All those departments are understaffed right now. So if anything's going to delay NEPA comments or delay NEPA projects, the staffing is definitely going to be the number one issue there. In addition to that, there's good evidence that, in fact, from the government, from the federal government, that public involvement in the decision-making process leads to better outcomes. So that's both better outcomes in terms of using resources efficiently. So that's, faster analysis or more efficient analysis, and better outcomes on the ground as far as meeting timber harvest goals. In fact, also avoiding listing new endangered species, and also there's good evidence that public engagement and public input leads to less litigation. I think it's easy to forget maybe that really this public involvement has been a part from the very beginning. There's a famous quote from Gifford Pinchot, something along the lines of, dealing with the public is a pain in the butt, but it's your job, it's what you're paid for, so you're going to do it. Somewhere that message, that ethos has been lost in the last few years of the Forest Service, it seems. And so reinforcing that we want more public involvement, more public oversight, which not only do we want it now, but that's the way it's been from the very beginning. I think that's something that should definitely be emphasized. And going back to everything we just talked about as far as what is leading to issues in the forest, as far as issues with fire, really, and issues with insect outbreak, a lot of the things that are going on in the Forest Service or in the forest lands, active management is a lot of times the root of those issues. And we do already have a pretty good toolkit for writing those comments on our website. If you go to this slideshow in that email that I mentioned, and this little underlined website that you see right here, that will take you right to the tool that's meant for writing those comments to respond to these new U.S. Forest Service rules. And we have just until March 9th at 9 p.m. here on the West Coast to submit those comments. All that is explained on the website. So, okay, that's it. I don't have anything else to cover here on the slideshow. So I'm gonna end my screen share here, and maybe what we will do is, since we have quite a few people on the call, if you have a question for me, and I should preface, I'm new to this, so if you are informed more than I am, I will not be offended if you want to chime in and be like, hey, actually, I can answer that question really well. Feel free to chime in and answer questions if you have insight. But otherwise, if you have any questions, there should be a way to raise your hand. If you go down to the React icon down at the bottom of your screen, there's a thing there to raise your hand, and that'll be the way that we'll move through questions here. Rob, what do you got? Make sure you hit that unmute button.
Yeah, I don't want to get in the way of everyone's dinner, but I'll make this quick. We have these legacy forests in Washington, and I tend to think of them mostly in terms of what has only had one cut, and that was a pre-industrial cut. So the legacy is still there. It hasn't been replanted. That's the main thing. And do we have any sense of how many legacy forests there are amongst, in the Federal Forest Service?
That's a good question. I can only give you kind of an off-the-cuff answer. Generally speaking, an area would not have been considered as for a roadless area if it had been recently logged. And that's going back to 1960 when they did the original inventory. So it's safe to say that any roadless area has not been logged since 1940, 1950 or so. So it's generally mature forest. I think it is just because it's old, it hasn't been logged in a while, doesn't necessarily mean it's legacy. A lot of those forests were replanted, right. And so there might not be snags left over. But generally speaking, yeah, the roadless areas are going to be at the very least mature forest, if not legacy forest.
Okay, thanks.
I got a question. I'm curious, can any of these things that are happening in the government be reversed by the next administration? Like if some of these bad things do happen?
Yeah, for the most part, well, as far as the rules are concerned, yeah, of course. Well, not of course. As far as the rules are concerned, yes. Of course, if it's logging, that's, that obviously can't be undone. So yeah, the Forest Service rules. The Forest Service is part of under the authority of the executive branch, so it's entirely up to. And honestly, I kind of wonder. Maybe it's just that Trump didn't expect to actually win the 2016 election, and so they weren't nearly as prepared because they could have gotten rid of this rule in 2016 or 2017 when he took office the first time. Probably they just didn't necessarily weren't as prepared as they were as far as Project 2025 is concerned, and all the preparation during Biden's administration. But yes, the next administration could definitely reinstitute something similar to the roadless rule. It's just important to realize that any changes that occur in between now and then, the roadless areas can only really shrink between now and then if they build new roads, if they do logging, then those areas wouldn't necessarily be considered as new roadless areas if the rules would be to put back in place. Same thing with the Forest Service's those regulations that I was just mentioning. Yes, the next administration could come in and say we want to go back to the things that were the rules that were in place previously.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Does that answer the question?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I guess my other question is, as a Washington State resident, it sounds like our senators are already pushing for, protecting the roadless rule and kind of on our side, more or less. So, I don't know. I feel like calling them doesn't really do much, but would you encourage me to just like try and get the word out more to like people in other states, or what do you think about that as far as activism?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it still is helpful to call Cantwell and Murray. It's definitely not high on their priority list, and I think there might be good reason for that between what's going on with ICE, what's going on with the budget, and all sorts of different things. There maybe are, in their opinion, more urgent things, but I think it's helpful for them to know that for some of us, the management of our public lands is a very high priority, right up there with a lot of other things. So definitely there's value in calling our Congress people and letting them know. And we do have, I think we have two Republican House members. I know Newhouse, and is it losing Camp Perez, I think maybe. So depending on where you are in the state, you might actually have a Republican as your House representative. And so there certainly is work to be done there, letting them know that the public has these opinions.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. You just said, but I think I missed it. Approximately how many legacy forests are in federal lands? I know you said they were from 1940s and legacy, but
Yeah. So I honestly, I can only give you kind of an off the cuff answer. I don't know. I'll
right.
definitely can get back to you. Joshua would be the one that can much more quickly do kind of the analysis to figure out exactly how much of the roadless areas are legacy. Are you asking about legacy in particular, or just forest lands in
Yeah,
particular in Washington? Roadless
the legacy.
areas?
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. So in theory, as my understanding is that no roadless areas will have been logged since roughly 1940. So they did the analysis, they did those inventories at the end of the 60s. It was 69 was when they did that, and the threshold was they needed to already have established forest stands on them. So roughly 1940, 1950 is the last time a roadless area would have been logged.
So they're wilderness areas.
Yeah, I mean it's all going to be mature forest for sure. If it's forest
Great.
land and it's a roadless
Okay.
area. The roadless area does also include grazing land, of course. A lot of BLM
Mm,
is grazing land, and so that's another topic altogether. But yes,
yeah.
if it's a roadless area and it's in Washington State and it's forest, almost certainly it's at the very least mature forest, if not legacy forest, because there's small distinction between the two.
Yeah. And we still should be calling Cantwell and Murray, I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I think it's there are so many issues right now that like unless the issue that you care about is getting amplified, there's a good chance that it's going to go by the wayside and not see any movement on it. So,
Which is
uh,
what you said in the beginning, that they didn't listen to 600,000 people, crazy.
Yeah, well, that's the administration not listening. I mean, I guess Congress is well aware that there were 600,000 comments, so they could have just taken that and decided, hey, obviously the public cares about this. Let's pass a law about it. It's the sort of thing, for it to pass on its own, it would need 60 votes in the Senate and whatever the substantial majority is in the House. And the Republicans have control over what goes into the appropriations bill, so it's complicated, but as it happens, I think like it's typically when there's a midterm, 8 Senate seats switch and like 26 or something House seats flip in any given midterm when the White House has changed hands. So fingers crossed that we'll have a little bit more power come either November or really January, I suppose, is when they'll actually be seated. But
no, it matters to keep in touch and keep pushing. Absolutely.
yeah, I mean the comments that we submit, it's very very common for when those debates are happening in Congress for the congressperson to hold up, here's the 600,000 comments that we got about this. The people care about this because the comments are public record. They can be requested via Freedom of Information Act requests. So those are a really valuable thing, even if the administration totally disregards what they're and does what they're going to do. Those comments that get submitted are still a valuable tool, whether it's in Congress or whether it's in the courts.
And just telling everyone about the Roadless Rule. I'm shocked that they don't know about it, but they don't. And when they hear about it, they look into it. So that's important. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I was honestly a little bit blown away by how many really popular hiking destinations are in roadless areas. I think there's no marking when you're going to a roadless area. There's no sign that says, oh, you just, when you cross into a wilderness area, sometimes there actually is a sign there that says you're entering whatever it is, designated wilderness. There's no way to know when you're just walking down a trail whether you're in a roadless area or not. And so, I will say I threw that hiking list together relatively quickly. So I put a little caveat there. Make sure you kind of do your own research to make sure, number one, the trail is open, the road to go to the trail is open, and that it's a hike that's suitable for you. But there's a lot of amazing hikes that are in roadless areas that are also in very valuable timber stands, as it happens. So,
well, Lena Lake's one of my
any other
favorites.
questions? We are just about at 7 o'clock, so I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but I'm happy to answer a few more questions if anybody has them. Well,
Thank you, Andy.
just take a chat here.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you all for being here. Yeah, it's great to see a lot of folks here. I never know when I'm putting together a slideshow whether or not we'll have 4 people here or 20 people here. It's good to have a bunch of faces. And yeah, spread the word. Hopefully I included a fact sheet as one of the things that you can download that's on that email that came just before the webinar here. So that has a lot of this kind of broken down, pretty concise. It should be pretty helpful if you're trying to remember some of these things, and you can always refer back to the whole PowerPoint is available there in a PDF. So, and my email, I don't know if I think it might be on the first slide, but it's just andrew@wlfdc.org. So if you want to get in touch with me, and of course we check the contact form on the website. So if you don't remember my email address, andrew@wlfdc.org, you can always just send a contact form through our website. All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. Submit some comments on those U.S. Forest Service rules. Like I said, there's a good tool on our webpage for that. And yeah, we'll be doing this every month. Don't know what next month will be. For all we know, there'll be a totally new emergency to respond to by next month. So it'll be something good though. So thanks everybody. Have a good night.